All right, everybody. So I am currently reading The Devil and Karl Marx by Paul Kengor. And I have to say, I'm one chapter in and I have quite a few problems with it. We can start with the preface. So in the preface, they speak about what they're going to do with the book, that they're going to decry communism, that they're going to decry Marxism. They make some quotes and attributions to Ronald Reagan and make it very clear that this is going to be come at from a religious right-wing perspective, which, fair enough. That's what we tend to see for these kinds of things in the United States. They do mention early on in the book that they won't go into ad hominem attacks. They won't talk about how Karl Marx might have been possessed, but they do cover how here are all these sources that show that he might have been possessed, and here's where all that evidence can be found, but we're not going to talk about that, we promise. To me, this seemed very early on like they were trying to poison the well before we even got into the book. So, going into chapter 1, we actually see a continuation of this and some pretty good evidence that they actually do intend to poison the well throughout the book. On page 16, for example, it talks about a scenario in which Karl Marx was with a fellow from the university, and they had gotten drunk. The fellow was walking Marx back to his home, and Marx was aggressive with him. This is something that occurs when people get overly drunk. It's not that uncommon for assault or other types of abuses to occur. It's not right. Marx shouldn't have done it, right? However, the language that's used to describe this goes into calling him Mephistocles. It calls him devilish. It calls him impish. And the authors make a whole lot of effort to point to these facts. And in fact, it kind of seems that it might be the case that they are trying to link devil worship directly to Marx. Now, from the perspective of their ideology, this is not something that I wouldn't expect to see. I was just more hopeful that I wouldn't see it from them. They said in the foreword that they wouldn't do this kind of ad hominem attack, and then they directly go into it. One of the other things that they did in Chapter 1 that I wasn't a big fan of, they used other people's words to decry Marx. So, for example, Marx was an atheist, and he spoke a good bit about religion, and of course they could use his own words in order to highlight this fact, but they don't do that. What they do is, on page 11, for instance, they talk about Lenin. They talk about Lenin's penchant for violence. They talk about Lenin's calls for people to be like the Jacobins, which were very violent revolutionaries in France, and they say, this is Karl Marx's ideology. When that's not something that Marx did or advocated for. Those were the activities of Lenin being used to decry Marx. On page 18, they use a fellow philosopher of Marx who was contemporaneous with him, called Bakunin, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who had very extreme views on religion. These are the kinds of views that would be seen as militant atheism today. And this is not something that Marx himself was, but the authors take a lot of effort to associate Marx and this other person in order to poison the well ahead of time. This is helpful later when they start to talk about concepts like the manifesto being a sort of catechism for a Marxist ideology or a Marxist religion, as well as when they start to talk about things like the opiate of the masses. The authors use this poisoning of the well to discredit Marx's ideas without actually addressing the ideas themselves. This is called an ad hominem attack, and it's a logical fallacy. His ideas have nothing to do with this personal attack on his character, these personal attacks of people related to him. And rather than attacking the idea, they attack the person, which tells me that they don't have a compelling argument against his ideas, merely against his person. This is simply flawed argumentation. So I actually want to go to page 24, because they do cover the opiate of the masses speech, and they cover their interpretation of it, which is not a very good interpretation, and is certainly not something that scholars would point to, scholars of Marx would point to as being his understanding or explanation of that. So, for instance, he says that religious suffering is, at one and the same time, the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of an oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. It is the opium of the people. Now, what Marx is saying here is that religion serves a beneficial purpose for many people in society. It provides them a sigh of relief when they look at life and are exasperated by it. It provides them with a soul in a soulless condition. It gives them purpose. It gives them drive. And it's the heart of a heartless world. It gives them some moral grounding to stand on and feel like they can give to their community and be part of their community. These are all things that Marx saw as being good aspects of religion. And the opiate of the people phrase, in today's context, we take to be a negative. We think of opium as being something that people are addicted to that leads to destruction and decay in our communities. But the reality is that for someone like Marx, who was living in the 18th century, the 19th century, this wouldn't have been as bad or as much of a negative as we would give it the connotation of today. So for Marx, the opium of the people, this was something that provided them ease and cared for their suffering, right? Religion being the opium of the people meant that religion was good for their mental and social well-being. Now, Marx did warn against religious power structures, because religion can be an extremely valuable way to maintain the status quo and to ensure that changes don't occur. If you want to control a population, religion is a very easy way to do it. But here in this particular passage, Marx is actually calling to the benefits of the religion and not the detriments of it. It's very important to keep this in mind. It's important to keep this in mind because this suggests that they are more likely to misrepresent his ideas on other topics, and that's something that we need to keep in mind as we continue to read through the book. Some of the other things that I want to highlight here, there is a lot of talk about his call to revolution, and this is something that existed in the original Communist Manifesto, but there were actual revolutions that attempted to occur in Cologne, for example, and this led Marx's partner Engels to actually retract these notions and these concepts from later versions of the Communist Manifesto, and indeed, modern surviving versions tend to interpret this a little differently based on that history. This is something that they were writing for the first time, and they needed to make adaptations and changes to. And I would agree that calls to violent revolution are wrong, and this is something that should never have been in the manifesto, but it does not in itself disprove any of the other ideas or concepts. On page 6, the authors talk about utopia, and the authors talk about the fact that utopia literally translates to no place. And they kind of make a joke about this, about how communists are reaching out for no place, a place that doesn't exist. But I think that this is kind of dismissive and misses the point entirely of what Marx and others are calling for. They're not calling for a literal utopia. When I say that I want America to be the shining city on the hill, that does not mean that it is currently the shining city on the hill or that it could ever actually achieve that goal. But it does mean that I want to take steps to move towards that goal and try and achieve it at some point in the future. Trying to achieve utopia is the same process. It's the same thing. It's a goal for us to strive for and not a realistic end state. And the fact that the authors want to take this out of context and say, no, that this is the ideal end state for them and they think it's literally achievable and look how silly they are, again, it feels to me like they're building a straw man and tearing it down. And that's really all I've seen throughout Chapter 1, is ad hominem attacks and straw men. Another straw man that they point to is that all of the countries that have ever lined up to use communism have resulted in massive amounts of violence. And this is absolutely true. Russia had massive deaths, communist China had massive deaths under the CCP, etc. But what they fail to recognize, and what they do intentionally and incorrectly, is they compare these to liberal democracies. And they say that communism is incompatible with a liberal democracy, or even socialism or Marxism more broadly is incompatible with a liberal democracy. What they fail to recognize is Russia, China, and the other countries that are mentioned were not liberal democracies at the time of the communist revolutions, and indeed they were brutal dictatorships in many cases. They point to how freedoms didn't exist in the USSR, and that's true. However, if you were a serf Under Tsarist Russia, prior to the revolution, you also didn't have those freedoms. We should criticize the USSR for this. This is a bad action on their part, but to try to associate this with Marx's ideology is flawed. These are the conditions that existed in the country prior to communism, and while communism didn't fix them, it didn't necessarily create those problems either. And the book, at least to this point, has failed to create that association. Those happened under communism, but that does not mean that communism caused them. They could just as easily have been caused by brutal dictatorial leadership under any other system that was not communism. Two other things that the book mentions are the 10 basic tenets that Karl Marx laid out for how to build a communist government. And I want to read these. These are located on page 8. And the interesting thing about these is that 8 of the 10 are things that we do in the United States. And the fact that they want to highlight these are things that largely exist within the United States. Some of them don't, but ought to. So for example, the first is the abolition of property and land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. This was something that Adam Smith, creator of capitalism, actually argued for. He argued that rent-seeking behavior, like putting a gate in a river to prevent people from riding up the river unless they pay you, you're providing absolutely no value to them. They could have gone up the river if you hadn't been there. This is a bad economic rent. This is drawing from a system without creating anything of value. What Marx is arguing here is that those kinds of rents should go away. And I think that's hard to disagree with, but we might talk more about that in further chapters, hopefully. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax, we have that in the United States. Abolition of all right of inheritance. We don't have this, and this would be controversial. This is one of my 2. Confiscation of all property of immigrants and rebels. If you rebel against the United States, or you fail to pay your taxes when you leave the country, you forfeit your property. That already happens today. Centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. This is the Fed. We have that. Centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. The internet is owned by the state, as well as the national highway system. We have that. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, the bringing into cultivation of wasteland, and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. We do not have this. However, we have components of this already existing in the United States with the FDA, USDA, and other regulatory agencies, as well as zoning laws that control how the land can be used from a governmental level. Equal obligation of all to work. I think an equal obligation to work is something that we all agree is a good thing, and in fact the authors themselves point to this as being a problem with Marx's utopian ideology, is that people would feel like they didn't have to work. So it's interesting that they would then highlight the need for everyone to work. It just goes to prove that they don't have a good argument, they just want to rely on ad hominems. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equitable distribution of the population over the country. They just describe federalism, which is something I'm sure they agree with. Free education for all children in public schools. We already do that. So those are his 10 major points, and of course the author takes issue with these, despite 8 of the 10 being things that we do in the United States already to some capacity or another. The last thing that I want to mention is that the author takes issue with what he describes as being essentially greed within the ideology of Marxism. He says that people in the ideology are obsessed with wealth and are obsessed with their own personal well-being. He contrasts this to something like capitalism, which he argues is not obsessed with wealth. But this flies in the face of everything that we understand about capitalism. For instance, we know that folks like Jeff Bezos are as wealthy as one can possibly be, can't possibly use any more wealth for anything, but choose to acquire more of it for themselves for no purpose other than the benefit of doing so. They want more gold and more power for themselves. Marxism actually argues for an economic system in which everybody reaps the benefits and everybody's needs are met, and in doing so creates a system where the acquisition of additional gold or power is not the goal, antithetical to what exists under capitalism. Now, I understand that people may not align to this ideology or may not adapt to it quickly, but that is the goal, and that is what Marx proposed, is a system of government in which the needs of all were met based on the resources that everybody provides collectively. That's all that I have for now. I will catch up on the next chapter and get back to you next week with more. Thank you for listening.